So welcome to all colleagues that are joining us today for this second webinar in the series. As Neil's already said, this webinar aims to support you really to overcome the challenges of delivering the new standards. And this slide here, I think the narrative on here sums up much of what we're all thinking. We know that we're moving from, what is a fairly well scaffolded framework to standards which are quite different within their design. And that, of course, is going to impact on how we demonstrate the planning and the implementation of programs going forward. So moving on to the next slide. A little reminder here, I think it's important that we remind ourselves of where we are now and where we're moving on to, and the changes and what is going to differ going forward as we move away from SASE. You may have seen this slide before. I think it's quite a clear diagram, for want of a better word, of showing where we are with SASE, where we are with the new apprenticeship standards, and what the differences are. And as you can see, gone is a requirement for a mandatory qualification within an apprenticeship. Gone is a certification of separate components, which, when we group them all together, confirm the competence of the apprentice and the achievement of the overarching apprenticeship qualification. That's all going. And instead, what we've brought in, or what they've brought in now, is the need to formally assess behaviours. Of course, the behaviours have always been important to employers and to us as training providers, or to you as training providers and to us as educationists. However, we now need to formally assess these behaviours, and I'll talk about those a little bit more as we go forward. Also in is a holistic endpoint assessment, which is to be carried out independently at the end of the programme. So rather than the continual assessment that we've had in the past, where we can, where we would assess a learner's competence in that particular component, and then they would move on to the other. Those days are now going, and it is all on the endpoint assessment at the end. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through these slides. In addition to that EPA, the endpoint assessment, much more emphasis is being placed on the professional competence of the learner, and that really is a product of the new standards being solely driven by employers. So what do we need to think about? This slide here, making the transition and some key considerations. It identifies what we need to think about when we're planning and also implementing the new apprenticeship standard within our programs. And it makes us think as a deliverer what the offer will be. So we need to consider what is going to be the offer. How are you going to decide this? To be able to decide this, you need to have a comprehensive understanding of what new standards entail and how they work. And ask yourselves and your organisation some questions. So what does your local labour market intelligence tell you? What's happening in your local area? Where are the skills gaps? Who and what are your competitors doing? What are they offering? Can you do something that's different? So to know what your competitors and those around you are offering, other FE colleges, possibly even UTCs and schools, as well as private training providers and, of course, employers now, because the whole world is changing and it's opening up to different institutions and organisations that can deliver. What have you already got in your offer? You may have programmes that you're already delivering that map across to the new standards. So to look at the new standards and see, where is that transition? Can that transition be made more simple because it maps quite closely to what is already in your programme offer? Another important aspect is to consider your staff and your teams. Are they briefed? Are they up to speed with the new world? Have they got the skills to deliver? Do they require professional development? And that's something that at Pearson we can help you with, and I will talk about that as we go through as well. When you've decided some of these things, then how are you going to actually deliver these new standards? What is going to be your delivery model? Does this include partnerships with other organisations to offer a more complete service and one that may work better in certain circumstances? Are you going to partner with other training providers, with colleges, with employers, delivering different aspects of the programme? That may be an opportunity, it may not be. And importantly, and maybe I should have mentioned this right at the beginning, how do you plan to recruit your learners? Where are your supply chain of learners going to come from? What are your relationships with local schools, recruitment agencies, etc., and colleges to help you recruit the right learner to the right programme? Of course, this isn't an exhaustive list. However, it does highlight the need to carefully consider these factors, and I'm sure you can think of more, to help plan your transition and implement your programmes going forward. So this slide, which is slide 13, aims to explain exactly what the new apprenticeship standard is. So let's just have a quick look at this. I'll have a little chat through the slide here. So we know that the new apprenticeship standards are designed by employers and that they are all around a singular occupation now. So rather than having pathways, which had a core set of units and some specialist units when you wanted to go off and, specialise in specific areas, these are individual, single occupational standards. And I mentioned earlier that there's a change in the way they will be assessed. So there's an endpoint assessment which is known as an EPA, and that endpoint assessment should only be accessed when the learner is at the right level and is competent enough to go through what is known as the gateway to access endpoint assessment. And it is that holistic element where that learner will be assessed across a range of competencies that they would have studied or learned during their time on the journey of an apprenticeship that will be assessed at that point. The third bullet point refers to grading. Now, the grading does vary according to the standards. There's not a one grading and one size fits all. It does depend, and sometimes that grading may just be a pass or a fail. In other situations, that grading may be a pass, merit or distinction, but that will be clearly annotated within the assessment standard. So it's really important that you understand that. The assessment, as I said, is holistic, so it will cover all of the theory, the underpinning knowledge, and all of the application that the learner would have covered during their journey on the programme. I've already said there's no formal requirement for qualifications. We're finding that some trailblazer employer groups favour qualifications within their apprenticeship standards when others do not. However, we at Pearson, we are looking to have an option of a qualification should you wish to include that. So even if it isn't part of the formal standard, there may well be a qualification that Pearson offers that you may want to include within your apprenticeship, and that's perfectly fine, and it's another certification for your learner as well. And it will also help you to manage your programme and your curriculum design. It says here about mastery mechanism, a single approach to assessment against a standard. What that means is that when every assessment standard was written by the Trailblazer Employers Group, it was signed off, as it was then by BIS, to say that that standard is appropriate and that is how it should be assessed. And that means that there can be no differentiation between how that learner is assessed at the end of that standard. What is written down in the assessment plan is standard assessment practice across the whole of England for any learner undertaking that particular occupational standard. The English and Maths ambition for GCSEs is still there, of course, wherever possible. However, functional skills is still a very appropriate qualification and one which was widely accepted, I think, when that was confirmed a little while back. Again, it remains the same levels as it does today in SASE. That, for example, if it is a level 2 apprenticeship, level 1 functional skills. If it is a level 3 apprenticeship, level 2 functional skills are the appropriate levels. Every apprenticeship going forward has a minimum of 12 months duration, and that is before the learner can access EPA, the endpoint assessment. They must have been on programme for a minimum of 12 months, and in some cases even longer, when we have some of the sort of more involved STEM type of apprenticeships that can actually go into the 3-year bracket. 20% of off-the-job training is a mandatory requirement of new apprenticeships, which does give that learner the opportunity for more self-study and those more complex areas around maths and English and other knowledge components that need to be delivered. That does support that. And of course the use of technology. So, you know, there's a lot of changes there. Going forward onto slide 14, which is about our programme planning. We do this. As you can see on the slide here, this programme planning is particularly looking at the new standards going forward. So we've got the apprenticeship standard, the apprenticeship plan, the information from both of those going together down into the individual learning plan. I know that we all do programme planning. It's something that we do currently within our SASE programmes. But currently we have a clear structure and a scaffold to use because we are using a qualification, an MVQ to guide the competence part of the delivery, and the knowledge certificate, which could be a BTEC, to give us the scaffold for the delivery around our knowledge. We have a specification for both of those, which we've always used. You know, I can talk from that from experience in the past, to design the curriculum, to deliver the programme and to plan our assessments. However, going forward, because we may not have a qualification within our standard, that scaffold that we've been very used to does no longer exist. So we will need to fully understand the apprenticeship standard and the apprenticeship plan, their content, how they work, in order to draw up and formulate a curriculum and an individual learning plan going forward. And this is where the mapping I mentioned on a previous slide will really help, because if we move to a new standard, or if you move to a new standard and it maps very closely into one that you may have delivered previously, one of the old ones under SASE, you'll be almost there with your delivery model. So it's a very useful activity when you're looking at planning your new apprenticeship standards and your programs going forward, to see where they do map and don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say. Also within the new standard, you'll be required to carry out on-programme assessment to measure your learners' progress in readiness for the EPA or endpoint assessment. Now that's probably something that we do already, because we have continuous assessment, I've alluded to already. Through a specification, we would be following a criteria for a learner, and then we would be following a formative assessment process. It's very similar to that, because we want to ensure that our learners going forward are absolutely ready for EPA. So just to reiterate on that, if it is a total new standard for an occupation that you've not delivered before, then you will really need to fully understand the content of the apprenticeship standard, dissect it and write the curriculum plan, which clearly annotates what the criteria is that the learner needs to prove competence in order to access the gateway to EPA. And Pearson are here to help you with this through our people, through our services and through our resources. Okay, so once we've designed our curriculum and we've got a good idea of how we're, what it looks like, we now need to deliver. So we've got some delivery considerations here on the screen in front of you. For some sector standards, the on-programme element, as I said already, may be very similar to your existing provision. However, some may not. We've got considerations around what's on-programme and what's off-programme, and different delivery methodologies that we need to consider to cover the key areas around knowledge, competence, behaviours, and maths and English, if, of course, maths and English have not already had to be achieved as a prerequisite to the learner accessing the standards that you're offering. So how can you plan the optimum delivery model? Let's take a look at how we might deliver the knowledge and the competence area. On the screen in front of you, there's 5 different areas that I'm going to talk you through. We've got on the job and off the job. We know that off the job has to be a minimum of 20%. Does it have a regulated qual or not, or a non-regulated qualification? What is the type of blended learning methodology you may implement? And will you use partnerships in this delivery? Deciding on the right balance of on-the-job and off-the-job delivery, it can be a bit of a tricky balance to get right. What does off-the-job really mean? Well, it means being away from the normal or usual site of work. It doesn't mean that learner has to sit at a desk in a classroom or whatever. They just don't need to be at the actual workplace that they are normally, or the workbench or whatever it is. So they need to be away from the site of work. That gives the learner the opportunity to undertake self-directed study. And talking about self-directed study, technology forms a really important part in this aspect, giving flexibility to both you as the deliverers and the teachers and the learner in learning opportunities, because we can access these opportunities at different times in different places through different mediums. Another thing to consider is who is in contact with the learner. Do we have mentors? We certainly have a tutor stroke assessor. We have the employer, of course. And what roles do all of those play? And how can we be confident and ensure standardization of approach from all of these touch points of the learner within our training programs? So it's really important to have clear communication and triangulation with the learner, the employer, and the delivery partners. Something I'm sure that you've done in the past, and we're looking to help make that particular part of the journey easier through some digital resources, which I'll talk about as we go through this presentation. What do we mean by blended learning? What does blended learning mean to you? To me, it means what's being learned in the workplace, the application, and what is being delivered through and maybe an online program for knowledge, mentoring, and also the mentoring will then support the behavioural aspects. Have you decided on partnership model? Does that work for you? Teaming up with other parties to either support the delivery, support your quality assurance, or deliver the endpoint assessment part of the apprenticeship. Also, does your standard include a qualification or not? And if it does include a qualification, is it a regulated qualification or a non-regulated qualification? All key points that we need to consider. And at Pearson, we have a range of teaching and learning resources to support this, your delivery, your part in assessment, and also for the learner to be able to support their learning journey throughout the whole of the programme. We can support you through our mapping services and our centre support teams. Plus, we can offer professional development training to upskill your staff to ensure the delivery of best practice going forward. I just spoke about on-programme qualifications to support delivery and help shape the curriculum. And just to reiterate that there may not be a formal requirement within the standard for a qualification. However, we at Pearson are mapping where we can and requested to our BTECs to standards. This supports your delivery and it gives the learner an additional qualification for their personal professional portfolio, and also in the, if a learner was unfortunate enough not to be successful within the whole of their apprenticeship program, that they could actually leave with a qualification of some sort. So this slide identifies how both regulated and non-regulated qualifications can be a positive addition to delivering the new standard apprenticeships. So here in the top three, if you look down the side where we have regulated and then we have the three lines, the top one looks at the competence qualification. So that could be a regulated qualification that has a design of units that are linked to the outcomes of standards, NVQs, etc. And will also have skills and behaviours within those and any specialist functions that the standard, the apprenticeship standard commands. And we're designing these in collaboration across sectors. So that's something that we've been talking to Trailblazer employer groups about. Going down to the next one, again, this is around knowledge, and this is if you were to have two separate qualifications, if you like, for one apprenticeship. So the top two lines clearly identify the fact that there is a knowledge component and a competence component, both of which are regulated, that the learner would go all the way through, as you do now with SASE, following the specification, following the formative assessments, and when they get through, the outcome of that would be the gateway to the EPA. Achieving that qualification is not part of EPA, but you would then be confident that your learner was ready for EPA. The third line under the regulated programme offer talks about a combined qualification, because we do know that some employers prefer a combined qualification to two separate. And that works in exactly the same way. And the very bottom line is around non-regulated. And for those of you who are not familiar with Pearson Assured, it's a non-regulated qualification or programme which meets specific and bespoke needs of employers within niche occupations. It is assured under the BTEC brand and it's recognised through our industry. However, it is not a regulated qualification, therefore it is not on the list, but that does not preclude you from being able to deliver it as part of an apprenticeship, and it could be a useful way to demonstrate achievement of knowledge, skills, behaviour, or a specific specialist function within the standards. Attitudes and behaviours. These have always been important, but now we have to formally assess these. We know it's important for the learner or the apprentice to have the right attitude and behaviour. Employers have long complained that it's this specific factor that lets prospective apprentices down. Not having that right attitude, aptitude to work, poor communication skills, lack of common sense, etc., are constantly being flagged up as a problem. Often despite the fact that on paper the learner, in inverted commas, has the academic requisite for the apprenticeship or the job. At Pearson, this is an area we've been developing resources and programs to support for some time now, and this can be very clearly seen across our traineeships, our employability and our apprenticeship programs to date. On this slide, top right, as you look at the screen, you'll see reference to a diagnostic tool called SmArt, which is an online, interactive and very accessible program that we've been working with over a few years now, particularly with our traineeships. And it gives a profile of the learner's resilience, emotional intelligence, etc., and identifies areas of strength of the learner and those that require support. And this helps to tell how the learner is feeling, how the learner responds to different situations. And not only does it tell you as the tutor or the deliverer of this, it tells the learner and it supports the learner through activities to improve in those areas where they need that support. It's proved very successful so far in to make improvements for individuals. And it's also been flagged up by Ofsted, who have said that it's excellent to measure the learner's progress or distance travelled for those aspects of the learner's journey that are not recognised or accredited through formal assessment. Apart from SmArt, we have Talent Lens, which is another sort of psycho-ed test. We've got lots of support and delivery for assessment through our Skilled for Life programs and our framework, and we are building currently a very extensive teaching and learning online digital resource which is accessible by the learners and by the tutors. Moving on to slide 19, Maths and English. This has always been a challenge within a work-based learning programme. And factors include maybe that our trained staff maybe aren't sufficiently trained as we would like them to, or having the confidence, having the sufficient time to deliver off the job, things such as English and maths, and also having sufficient time off the job for self-study. One of the key things that's always been flagged up about English and maths as well is how best to contextualise and make it relevant for the learner and make it motivating and interesting and prepare them for assessment. We now have a fantastic new rich feedback service, which has been available, is available as from now, September 2016. And I advise you to go onto our website and have a look at that. We've got our levels of maths and English through our GCE and also through our functional skills, which I've just mentioned to you on an earlier slide. We have a plethora of supporting teaching and learning resources to include Smart Thinking, again, which is digital, Exam Wizard, and a load of functional skills resources. So please take a look at that and make sure that your learner is ready. English and maths must be passed before the learner goes on to EPA. And now I'm going to hand you over to Neil.
Just got one question, Cheryl. Okay, so the question was, is Self-Smart available for providers to use with current apprentices?
Yes, yes, it will be. You can purchase Self-Smart as an individual support tool, if you like. It's been used with our Skilled for Life framework and also our traineeships for some time now. And yes, you can. What I would suggest you do is have a word with your regional account manager or your curriculum development manager. I'm not sure whether you're from an FE centre or a training provider. And we can sort that out. But please go on our website. There's and look up Self-Smart, and it will tell you a lot about it. I haven't got the time to go into it. I could spend a good hour or so talking about it, but it will give you enough information.
Okay, and just to add to what Cheryl said there, one of the future events that we're planning in the series will be on integrating English and Maths into new apprenticeship standards, and that will run through in a bit more detail these kind of support materials, including some that we haven't mentioned just yet. Okay, thank you. So, moving on to on-programme assessment, nearly lost my track there. So slide here, you should have slide 20 in front of you now. On-programme assessment, pretty much what we're used to calling continuous assessment, to be quite honest. It's monitoring the progress of the learner through formative assessment opportunities to ensure that they are ready for endpoint assessment. Because we don't want to put a learner through for endpoint assessment for several reasons. We wouldn't want them to fail because it's not good for their motivation and their engagement, but equally it's not good for our pockets either from an expense perspective. So we want to make sure our learners are as ready as they possibly can be. So we know the types of things that learners may be assessed against as an EPA, and as well as looking at it from an ongoing perspective throughout the whole of the programme, we also want to prepare them for what they may come up against within their endpoint assessment. So that could be during the programme, you may be having one-to-ones for monitoring progress, and I'm sure you do because we all have tutorials with our learners. If you're delivering a formal qualification as part of your apprenticeship, of course, they would pass, they would take the necessary assessments for that formal qualification, and that would give you the information that that learner is ready to go forward to the EPA gateway. The quality assurance of training and learning, you would be doing that through your assessors and the practice that you have with your deliverers and assessors within the workplace. So, there's lots of things to consider there. How you monitor on-programme assessment and how you get to the point where you think your learner, or your learner is then ready to go through what we call the gateway, ready to take their EPA. So slide 21, once the learners confirm they're ready to go through the gateway, they could be put forward for endpoint assessment. Now, by this time you would have as part of your planning of the programme, right back, if you can remember, right to the beginning of this presentation, we would have been looking at planning how we're going to deliver and assess the whole of our programmes. And at that point, you would have engaged with an organisation to deliver EPA. You would have planned when that learner, in theory, should be ready for that EPA. We know that they can't be doing it for 12 months, minimum of 12 months.
and we would have arranged with the organisation that's going to carry out the EPA nearer the time when they're likely to do that. So the EPA methodology will depend on what is in the assessment plan, and it could include different types of assessment, which could be a professional discussion, a multiple choice test, a written exam, observation, portfolio, could be a combination of one, two or more of the above. It may just be one of them. It really does depend what is written into that assessment plan right at the beginning. And to give a flavour really of how all this works in practice, I'm going to hand over to my colleague Neil now, who is going to link up with the recording that my other colleague Nathan, who is Business Skills Sector Manager, and he will take you through customer service and how it works in practice. Thank you.
Okay, just before we do that, Cheryl, one interesting question came in that I think we should probably address before we move on. Will employers need any formal qualifications to carry out on-the-job assessments?
Right. As part of the apprenticeship standard, it depends what the apprenticeship standard says. So the apprenticeship standard may have a qualification in it, it may not have a qualification in it. The qualification would need to be assessed by somebody. If it has got a formal regulated qualification in it, that assessment for that would have to be undertaken by somebody with the appropriate qualifications, if you like, and teaching qualifications or tutoring or assessing qualifications. If your apprenticeship standard didn't, and it was just part of an ongoing assessment, formative assessment, then the answer to that is no, because it doesn't count towards the EPA. The endpoint assessment is totally independent. It is the EPA that would need to be carried out by competent, qualified individuals to prove the competence. So just to go back one step, in a new standard, if there is no qualification and that learner is being formatively assessed on their progress towards the gateway for EPA, no. If it is a regulated qualification within the apprenticeship, the answer is yes. Hope that makes sense.
Okay, so one more question. Who is the assessment organisation?
Right, the assessment organisation for EPA is whoever you've got the agreement with to carry out and undertake the endpoint assessment. Now, there's been some confusion over communications from SFA, from DFE, BIS, and now the IFA, all these acronyms, the Institute for Apprenticeships, which have finally started to meet and come out with various bits and pieces. And part of what they've come out with now is revaluing, for want of a better word, what the word independence means. Originally, the EPA, the endpoint assessment, had to be undertaken by an independent organisation that had nothing to do with the delivery of the apprenticeship. Okay, so if you are a training provider delivering an apprenticeship, at that point it was saying that as a training provider you could not endpoint assess because you've been involved in the delivery. The same if you were an employer delivering, you could not EPA the programs you have been delivering. Now there is a slight change in that thought, because I think there's been a lot of rallying around by employers saying, well, surely we're the employers, we're the best people to be able to say whether that person's competent or not. So they've moved the goalpost slightly, that it doesn't have to be a totally separate organisation going forward, but you must demonstrate that there is no conflict of interest between the delivery side of the apprenticeship and the assessment, the EPA, the endpoint assessment side of the apprenticeship. There has to be a Chinese wall between the two if it is going to be undertaken by the same organisation. So that's what we mean by assessment organisation. It has to be an assessment organisation that is on the register of apprenticeship organisations. There is a register for apprenticeship assessment organisations, which is controlled by the SFA. Any organisation that wants to carry out EPA has to go through a PQQ and submission to RAW, as we call it, RAAO, and to put your application in, which looks at capability, capacity, etc., quality assurance, to see whether you qualify for being on the register. If you are on the register and you're approved as an EPA assessment organisation, then you are for that standard. So there's quite a lot of hoops to go through, and I'm sorry that was probably a bit of a complicated way of answering it, but hopefully it made some form of sense.
Okay, thanks very much, Cheryl. We'll just pause for 30 seconds or so just to see if any more questions come in before we move on to Nathan's segment. Okay, so we've had another question come in. This is from Graham Watts. Where would I find the changes you mentioned around assessment organisations?
Okay, Graham, when you say the changes around assessment organisations, I'm not quite sure which angle you're coming from. If you could give me a little bit more information, or I'm happy to take this offline because I realise that time is ticking on. Maybe if you can give Neil your email address, I can come back to you with that.
Changes relating to who can end assess.
Right, who can end assess are only organisations that have been accepted on the register of apprenticeship assessment organisations, which is that register that the SFA own, and they open it monthly and say which standards are on there, which are open for applications. As an awarding organisation ourselves, we've applied. You don't have to be an awarding organisation. Anyone could apply to the register, but it is a very rigorous and robust submission application form you have to complete, and they go, quite rightly so, they go through it with a fine-tooth comb and then say, yes, you are eligible, or no, you are not eligible, and come back with more evidence. But no one who is not on that register would be able to assess the EPA part of an apprenticeship going forward. Happy to take that offline as well if it helps. Just, as I say, give Neil your email address and I'll come back to you on a one-to-one.
Okay, so just before we go into our colleague Nathan Cookson's segment, because I'm aware that some of you may have some difficulties hearing the audio of that segment and may have to drop off in order to watch it on your own machine. I just wanted to draw your attention to the next two events that we've got coming up. Event number 3, the date of which has been changed to the 5th of October. It's been rescheduled from next week in order to ensure that we can get our guest presenters in the room all at the same time. That one's going to focus on targeting and winning employer clients. So it's going to look at the commercial and business model considerations of these changes. I'm pleased to say that we have 2 confirmed providers as guests. We're going to be joined by a representative from Birmingham Metropolitan College, and from our own in-house training provider Pearson TQ we'll have someone from there giving a segment, and I'm also hoping to confirm in the next couple of days a representative of one of the key representative bodies of this sector. I'm not going to say who because there's still a possibility they may say no. There are still a few spaces for that one, so if that's of interest to you, please do register today. The day before, confusingly, number 4 will run. That one's going to be led by by our head of funding, Sian Owen. I believe she's also bringing some friends along to help her out with that, and that's one for your MIS and your finance people, just to look at some of the details of the funding bands now that some confirmation is coming through from SFA about how things are going to work in future. Okay, so let's go back to Nathan's video, which I'm going to play for you now.
My name's Nathan Cookson. I'm the sector manager at Pearson for the business skills sector, and that's responsible for the product management of all qualifications and apprenticeship products and services that Pearson offer in the business skills sector. And in this case, this includes customer service. So this is really just an opportunity for us to talk about the new customer service practitioner Trailblazer standard. 5 minutes we'll spend talking around the standard, how it works, and then another 5 minutes just kind of sharing some information around Pearson's approach to supporting customers, employers, apprentices in regards to delivery of this apprenticeship standard. So this is the first slide, and this is really a high-level overview of the Customer Service Practitioner Standard, and this is lifted straight from the Customer Service Practitioner Assessment Plan. Really, I wanted to focus on the two main components of the Customer Service Apprentice and really bring it to life. This is a really good standard because it's very far forward in regards to its implementation. The assessment plan signed off, the standard signed off, and it's ready for delivery. So really this is the first opportunity to talk about standards in practice. The first component I want to focus on is on-program learning. And as you'll see here, this really takes the form of four main elements. There's the on-the-job training, the off-the-job training, overarching learning and development, and English and maths. What I would say is when referring to on-program learning, it's very important to look at the actual apprenticeship assessment plan, because in the assessment plan for the Customer Service Practitioner Standard, you'll see the standard as it is, but supporting that, there's very detailed modules, assessment criteria, and learning outcomes that apprentices really have to achieve during that on-program phase of their apprenticeship standard. Something you'll see with the on-program learning is there's no mandated qualification within the Customer Service Practitioner apprenticeship. And this isn't unusual for the business skills sector, and it's a recurring pattern across the majority of business skills apprenticeships, such as business administration, management and leadership. So what you'll find is there's no mandated qualification. However, when I say why the assessment plan is so important, is because when you look at the criteria, you will see that actually it almost resembles a qualification. There are modules, there are learning modules, there are assessment criteria, and there are learning outcomes that learners have to achieve. What we anticipate during this period of on-program learning is that over a period of minimum of 12 months, an employer, and in the main we anticipate it's supported by a training provider or an FE college, will be going on site, visiting the apprentice, visiting the employer, and supporting them in regards to their formative assessment. So what they'll actually be doing is undertaking many of the activities that would happen within a qualification. There'll be training and development, there'll be an opportunity for learning interventions, and essentially the employer, with the support of the training provider or FE college, will be gathering evidence against the criteria within both the standard and the assessment plan. The aim being, after a period of minimum of 12 months, the apprentice has demonstrated that they can achieve, can demonstrate with evidence the skills, knowledge and behaviours of the apprenticeship standard for customer service practitioner. And like I said, that would take a minimum of 12 months, and that is specified within the assessment plan and apprenticeship standard. At which point the apprentice will come to something called the assessment gateway, and really that can be as complex or as simple as the employer and the provider want to keep it. But essentially the purpose of the assessment gateway is that there's a mutual decision made by the employer in support of their training provider and with a conversation with the apprentice where they make a decision that the apprentice can demonstrate achievement of the on-programme learning, so the criteria within the assessment plan, and are ready for endpoint assessment. What we know about endpoint assessment and what's clear with the guidance from DFE is that endpoint assessment has to be an independent assessment activity. And when we say independent, that essentially means that the person who has been supporting the apprentice in regards to on-programme learning, so the employer, the training provider assessor, an individual who is delivering the L&D, cannot in any way assess that apprentice in regards to the endpoint assessment. It has to be an independent assessor. So when the learner or the apprentice is ready for endpoint assessment, the way I like to refer to it is almost a three-hurdled approach, whereas the apprentice has to achieve each hurdle of endpoint assessment in regards to achieving their overarching apprenticeship programme. The first hurdle is something called the Apprentice Showcase. So what the Apprentice Showcase is, it's really a reflection on what the apprentice has achieved during their on-programme learning. So a reflection of the skills, the knowledge, the behaviours they have gathered and evidence during on-programme. And then this will be presented in an independent form of evidence. Conversations with customers today, it's almost anticipated that you can lift the portfolio that's been developed on programme learning and present that as the Apprentice Showcase. What I want to say today is that's not the case. The apprentice cannot simply lift their portfolio and present that as an Apprentice Showcase. What they need to undertake is some kind of reflective activity that draws upon what they've learned from the portfolio and evidence within the portfolio, and then present that to the independent assessor. The assessment brief for the Apprentice Showcase is currently being written by our development specialists, but how this will be designed is that it will be very flexible. So we do not want to say or stipulate in the endpoint assessment brief for the Apprentice Showcase that every learner has to do a presentation, a face-to-face presentation. Yes, some apprentices may be fantastic at articulating face-to-face what they want to say and what they want to demonstrate. However, what we know is everybody's different. So what we will provide is the opportunity for apprentices to present their Apprentice Showcase both in person, should they choose to, in regards to, say, a face-to-face presentation, but also virtually. And that could be the form of an activity, an assignment, a reflective statement. Many different forms of evidence could take the Apprentice Showcase. And like I say, that will be stipulated very shortly when we write an assessment brief to support. Following successful completion of the Apprentice Showcase, the learner will then move on to a practical observation. And this is what we're all used to. This is essentially where the apprentice will be observed in the workplace by an independent assessor. And this we anticipate will take up to 1 hour. Following completion of the practical observation, the apprentice will then move on to the third hurdle, which is a professional discussion. And again, this is exactly what we're used to, a one-to-one discussion with the endpoint assessor, focusing on various elements of the standard. What I would say is when reviewing the apprenticeship standard and the assessment plan, within the assessment plan it clearly identifies which elements of the standard that the apprentice has to achieve for which hurdle. So what I mean, for example, is that there'll be certain knowledge, skills and behaviour that has to be evidenced in the Apprentice Showcase. There'll be certain knowledge, skills and behaviours that has to be evidenced in the practical observation and the professional discussion. And that's clearly marked within the assessment plan. Following achievement of all those three hurdles, at that point a decision will be made whether the apprentice is pass or has not yet passed their apprenticeship programme. Successful completion means that they then can be issued with the apprenticeship certificate. So really that's a high-level overview of the customer service apprenticeship end-to-end proposition. And I think it's, like I said at the beginning, it's a very important apprenticeship standard, and when looking at the other apprenticeship standards in the business skills sector, you will see that they pretty much replicate this style of apprenticeship. So that's great, actually. All in all, that explains the end-to-end process. But what I also want to share is actually how Pearson as an organisation can support your employers, can support you as a training provider or FE college, and can support your apprentice in achieving the customer service practitioner apprenticeship standard. And what we've designed is a number of different products and services that you can acquire from Pearson in regards to supporting you. It's essentially, as it says in the top, it's a complete solution that you can pick and choose elements of our service proposition that you may want to deliver to your apprentice. So what I'm going to do is start on the furthest left honeycomb and essentially go clockwise as we talk around each proposition. So the first one being endpoint assessment. And it says in the slide, this is a full end-to-end apprenticeship endpoint assessment service that Pearson will offer. So what I mean by that is that on the Register of Apprenticeship Assessment Organisations, Pearson will be submitting our application very shortly to become a registered endpoint assessment organisation for this standard. And what that will mean is that you have the choice, and your employers have the choice, to acquire from Pearson a full independent endpoint assessment service. An example of what this will look like is that Pearson, we will recruit an identified endpoint assessor who will then support your apprentice in regards to delivering that endpoint assessment. That's one very basic solution to endpoint assessment. The second solution to endpoint assessment, and it's something that initial discussions are taking place in Pearson at the moment, is actually looking at how, as an awarding organisation, as an endpoint assessment organisation, we can work closer in partnership to deliver endpoint assessment. So how can Pearson work in partnership with colleges, with training providers to deliver endpoint assessment? And what I mean by that is actually whether there's an opportunity for Pearson to be the overarching endpoint assessment organisation, but almost, I don't want to say subcontract, what I want to say is approve organisations to deliver the endpoint assessment services on our behalf. Moving on, it's then accredited qualifications and certification. As I mentioned in the previous slide, there is no mandated qualification in the customer service practitioner standard. However, we'll be offering two solutions here. The first solution is that we will be mapping the existing level 2 diploma in customer service to the apprenticeship standard, so that should you decide to, there'll be opportunities to use the qualification to identify how the apprenticeship standard can be achieved. So essentially how the customer service diploma can be used as a vehicle for the apprentice to gather that formative evidence to demonstrate that they are on track to achieve the skills, knowledge and behaviours within the apprenticeship standard. At the same time, as a result of undertaking the qualification, there is an accredited qualification that supports the overarching standard. We think it's important, based on our conversations with customers, based on our research, that initially we focus on the existing level 2 diploma, which really has only been live for 2 years and isn't quite mature yet as a qualification. So we feel maintaining that consistency in regards to using existing qualification is a better approach, as opposed to designing a brand new qualification that mirrors the customer service practitioner standard. The second element to this honeycomb slide, accredited qualification and certification, is that what Pearson will be designing is actually also a BTEC specialist qualification that mirrors the endpoint assessment criteria. The benefit of this is that any apprentice undertaking their endpoint assessment through Pearson as an endpoint assessment body would also achieve a BTEC specialist qualification. So it's almost dual awarding the apprenticeship. A successful learner will end up with their apprenticeship certification, but at the same time they'll also end up with a BTEC specialist, essentially adding value and kudos to the achievement of the apprenticeship standard. The next honeycomb, assessment support. Much of our research with employers, providers and colleges has identified actually that something called pass first time is crucial. When I say pass first time, obviously nobody can guarantee that apprentice is going to pass endpoint assessment first time, but what we can do is support you in best preparing your apprentice for the assessment. And what I mean there is that Pearson will be designing a range of creative, exciting assessment support tools that you can use during the end of your on-program phase to really best prepare the apprentice for their endpoint assessment. So that will include things such as videos around best practice of observations, how to prepare for a professional discussion. What we know is that a prepared and a confident apprentice going into endpoint assessment is likely to result in an outcome that is a positive, and as we say, hopefully pass first time. Then going on to the Trailblazer toolkit, what we will be designing, very similar to a specification, is a non-program and endpoint assessment toolkit that really articulates the apprenticeship standard. So it will offer amplification around the skills, knowledge, and behaviours in the standards. So really identifying the types of evidence, the types of activities that an apprentice could be undertaking to demonstrate that they're achieving or on track to achieving their knowledge, skills and behaviours. Moving on to the endpoint assessment toolkit, this is where we will articulate the requirements of endpoint assessment and also supply providers, colleges and employers with the endpoint assessment briefs. And what I mean by the briefs is the evidence activities, the assessment activities that we would expect a learner to be undertaking. This is particularly important for the apprentice showcase. The second two honeycombs, English and Maths and bundles, is really kind of self-explanatory. As an awarding organisation, Pearson, we offer both English and Maths functional skills and English and Maths GCSE. And what we will do is we will bundle these registrations to English and Maths within our overarching customer service endpoint solution. And what I mean by bundle is there'll be an opportunity to, via a one-click registration, to acquire endpoint assessment services, to acquire the qualification, to acquire English and Maths in one click. Alternatively, there'll be the opportunity to register for each of these products individually, essentially streamlining the administrative processes at your end in regards to managing the endpoint assessment for your apprentice. Going then to the top right, rich feedback. And this is something we've implemented recently with our functional skills offer. What we know is critical with apprenticeships is that fabulous if an apprentice passes first time. However, for those apprentices who do not pass first time, we want to offer enhanced rich feedback. So identify those areas of the standards where the apprentice is excelling and those areas of the standard where further development is required, so that you as a training provider, as an employer or a college, can focus on those particular areas of standards that needs remedial action. New apprenticeship standard implementation and events. I guess we're on these now in regards to the Insight webinars. However, in early 2017, we'll be offering delivering a number of implementation events to support you in regards to delivering your apprenticeship standards. These will of course be in customer service, but in also a number of other apprenticeship sectors that Pearson will be involved in. Finally, the last part of the offer is digital learning resources. And this almost interlinks with the assessment support, but what we will be developing here through our relationship with AppQual is digital learning resources where your apprentice will have the opportunity to undertake some digital resources, some digital activities, and the opportunity to gather evidence during their on-program phase of the apprenticeship. And they'll have access to a digital learning resource to do this. And as these resources become available, we will slowly roll these out for customers. So that, in summary, at a high level, is an overview of Pearson's complete solution to support you as an employer, to support you as a training provider, to support you as a FE college, and ultimately to support your apprentice in regards to helping them achieve their customer service practitioner standard. And now I'm going to hand back to Neil and Cheryl. Please do feel free to ask any questions at the end of this Apprenticeship Insight webinar. Thank you.
So that was our Customer Services and Business Skills Sector Manager, Nathan Cookson, giving a rundown on one of the standards that's furthest advanced into its development. So at this point we're back with Cheryl, if you'd just like to run through the final few slides.
Okay, thank you very much, Neil. You've still got control of the slides, so if you don't mind clicking through those for me. Is that okay? Right, that was really interesting from Nathan, and really I would just like to reiterate that much of our solutions and support that you can see on the slide in front of you, slide 25, it really reflects what Nathan was talking about, and that we can, or we are, as Pearson, replicating that honeycomb offer that Nathan went through for customer service across other standards, other sectors, etc. Because we, as Nathan alluded to, we have carried out extensive research with employers, with providers, with colleges, etc. Into how we can best support you, our centres, and through that research, and it is continuing research, we've developed a comprehensive and compelling solutions and support proposition, which you can see on the slide in front of you now. In addition to these this particular support around the endpoint assessment, and Nathan referred to the toolkit that's there to support you with that, we're helping you with employer engagement support. We will very soon be launching a brochure and some marketing collateral to help you with your relationships with employers and with training providers, FE, and employers. Our sector managers are there. They're your touch point. They're your personal contacts. You have a named contact. Use them. They're there to help you. We've got, of course, that full suite of BTEC apprenticeships currently, which is still there. We're in that phase of the SFA, etc. Through the SASE withdrawals, but there's still many sitting there, and we still got those. And also, of course, we've got our BTEC qualifications that Nathan referred to, which of course he's using within the customer service suite, and we have had indication from quite a few of the Trailblazer employer groups that they really do value including a BTEC qualification to support their delivery. We've got the tailored traineeships there, which is on bullet 5, which will help any learners that maybe aren't quite ready for that apprenticeship yet and just need that little sort of step up, if you like. And the last bullet point there around sector forums and road shows that we have. Of course, we have this series of Insight webinars currently, and please look out, because there'll be information coming out and winging its way to you over the next few weeks to tell you about some of our launch events that we'll be running very early in 2017, and I'm sure Neil may allude to those before we leave you today. In addition to what you see on your slide here, we've got a lot of learning resources and teaching resources of a digital nature, which we will be advertising on our website very soon and giving you more information. They're currently in development, and they will be there to support your delivery and your learners' learning very early in 2017. Next slide, please, Neil. Thank you. And the final slide we have here. So a bit of a summary slide, really. Are you ready for liftoff? It says preparing for liftoff, and you can see 6 stages on there, and I think we've pretty much covered those throughout this webinar today. If you follow these 6 steps and implement your program, and Pearson will support you, then you're definitely ready for your organisation and learners to take this journey, which is the new apprenticeship standards. one thing I would just like to reiterate just before we go, because I didn't mention it earlier and maybe I should have done, was that to be an organisation that delivers apprenticeships, you must ensure that your organisation is on the register of Assessment Training Organisations, or RATO, R-A-T-O, Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations, because unless you have registered and been accepted on that register, you will not be able to deliver new standard apprenticeships. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So you've got RATO, Register of Apprenticeship Training Organisations, that you must be on to deliver, and then if you want to endpoint assess, you must be on the RAW, which is the Register of Apprenticeship Assessment Organisations, and be approved on that to become an endpoint assessment organisation. So there's two distinct registers that you need to be on depending on what you want to include within your delivery. And I just really wanted to clarify that at the end of my section here. And that's it from me really today, and I'll hand you over to Neil if there's any questions.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so that's the end of our programme content for today. We've overrun slightly. Thank you for bearing with us. That overrun's largely due to the technical difficulties with one of our presenters not being here and us having to virtually zoom him in. Cheryl, there was one question that came in while the video was playing, which I don't think we've addressed yet, and that was around whether or not the training provider prescribes the level of formative on-programme assessment required.
Right, so if I've understood that question correctly, Neil, that is, does a training provider decide how much formative assessment is required on programme? The assessment plan will normally apply specifically to the EPA, although it may have some reference to formative assessment. The assessment standard will lay out what the criteria is that the learner has to be competent in order to achieve mastery standard, if you like. Now, unless there is a regulated qualification within the standard, then as far as I understand this, it will be totally up to the training provider as to how much formative assessment they feel they need to carry out, and exactly what that formative assessment will be to confirm that that learner is ready to go through the gateway. I would suggest, very much like Nathan did, we know, if we know our assessment standard, which we must know, we will know what that learner needs to achieve to pass EPA. So that should give a really good guidance to you as the deliverer as to where you should be assessing that learner on that learning journey to make sure that they're in the right place at the right time to be able to be put forward to the gateway. If there is a formal qualification as part of that, of course, in addition to the training provider carrying out some assessment, you will also be carrying it out through a training provider, as you do now with your knowledge component. And then it would be verified finally by the awarding organisation, but that's only if there's a formal qualification that's included. Otherwise, it would be down to the TPO to make that decision. Thank you, Neil.
Thank you, Cheryl. Okay, so just to reiterate, ladies and gentlemen, our next two events, confusingly not in numerical order, targeting and winning employer clients, which is event number 3, will be next Wednesday, 5th of October, 4 until 5 p.m. If you're wondering how you go about this much more commercial business environment post the changes, this one should be for you. We've got a couple of case studies from providers and hopefully a representative from a peak body for this sector, and that will be lead presented by our Director of Strategic Partnerships, James Emmett, and Gary Tovey, our Stakeholder Relations Lead. The preceding day, Sian Owen will go through the new funding regime, and I'm led to believe that she is also bringing some friends along with her. Finally, you keep in touch with us. We can make these events much more targeted at what you need and answering the questions you need answered and focusing on the topics that you really need to deep dive into. So there's several ways you can do that. You can follow us on Twitter, which is currently at BTEC Apprentice. There's our LinkedIn company page. There's our Insight newsletter, which you can subscribe to. Our new blog, which we're currently, we have a team of experienced people beavering away, putting their thoughts down on paper, and indeed we will have more of these events in future. Like I say, we will go wherever you need us to go, so let us know what you'd like to know. That's it for today. Please enjoy the remainder of your evening. Thank you for coming along today. We're going to hang around for a few minutes just to see if any more questions come in. But I bid you good night, and thank you for joining us.